We'll move on to our final speaker before the panel. So I'd like to invite Silvia, if you want to go ahead and share your screen, we can do that now. Dr. Silvia Maier is a member of the Swiss Young Academy, where she investigated with her colleagues in the project Who Gets Heard, how scientists can best convey information to members of parliament. She also contributes as a communications trainer to the Franchini project of the Swiss Young think tank REACH that fosters understanding and exchange between scientists and policymakers. She holds numerous credentials, including a PhD in neuroeconomics, and has different experience working as a journalist, editor, and communications consultant. Thank you for joining us today for your talk, Sustainable Volunteering and Neuroscience-Informed Perspective.
Yeah, thanks for the invite. And I'm very happy to come back to the MRI community that I have been a part of for the 10 years of my PhD and postdoc, in which I always worked with fMRI. And also, this is my opportunity to first say thank you to Lars and also Johanna for the physio toolbox that I have been a happy user of. You will be mentioned in one of my slides, not by name, but by concept. So the volunteering project the last one that I ran, that was basically even running while I had technically already left my scientific appointment, is this project Who Gets Heard, where it's not technically an open science project, but it actually tries to make science open and applicable to people who want to use it in society, or also policymakers who want to do evidence-based decisions. So that was actually, and it's maybe rather characterized as a research project. It accidentally turned into a full research project without us noticing what we are loading on our plates. We were 4 people, plus luckily one very gifted PhD student who served as our interviewer and evaluator for all the interviews we did with policymakers. The whole thing ran in 3 years, and we should have not done that on the budget of 30K Swiss francs that we actually obtained for it, because much of the actual contributions that we made here were actually made on our borrowed time, as Johanna nicely termed it. But now it's here, and that's actually a happy thing, because now we can work with it. And I'm still actually active as a member of the Swiss Young Academy until next year, and I will also still go in teaching mode in order to bring these results and knowledge back to the community. So that's a massive and maybe slightly different project, but it's in a way similar in terms of like what it means for your private life. And also here's the slide for Lars, Johanna, and everybody else in the room, because the volunteering bit is actually crucial, as I learned as a user. So that people actually maintain all the toolboxes that we are working with. And so that is first a big thank you to everyone in the room, because that is actually something that is probably underappreciated in actually running the day-to-day bits of science, but it's something that otherwise we couldn't actually work with so well. But it ends up with, in your agenda, you've talked about it already in the earlier talks, is that we end up having a lot of stuff to do. And so I will continue the flow of what this means in terms of saying, actually, I will deliver you a couple of science-backed arguments for saying, okay, you need to take your priorities seriously and make sure that you do what you actually like to do. Because there's always going to be too much to do if you start on the volunteering track. So much like everybody else, I also had a very long history of volunteering that basically started in school, because I actually do like to do things that challenge me and also help me to explore new projects or new ways. And volunteering to me was always a great way of having a side career in the end that now turned into my main career. But on the other hand, that means on the day-to-day, you actually end up having too much on your plate, and there's absolutely no way how I can tell you there is a miracle cure for that, how you can now organize it all very nicely. That was actually the screensaver of the first year of my PhD too, minus the guy in the front. And that is the screensaver of the second year of my PhD, where I also ran volunteering stuff on the side. And I learned actually to manage myself better. And that's the point where I want to take you today, because that's a thing I can speak on based on my scientific background. I noticed pretty early that when I want to actually keep running my volunteering hobbies that actually kept me very much alive, I have to collaborate a bit better with my brain in order to make sure that everything can happen in my life that I want to happen. And so I actually studied self-control for 10 years. And here's the takeaway. The last couple of years were very exciting, and that's actually work from other people, not my own. But I want to give you good arguments for saying you need to prioritize. A thing that we know, meanwhile, about self-control, that it seems to be metabolically costly. There's really cool work from the lab of Matthias Pesciglione at the ICM in Paris. That shows actually when you simulate a workday in the lab, where you put people in the lab from the morning to the afternoon, 6 hours in a row, and you either give them completely like easy tasks or completely hard tasks, or you let them switch between easy and hard. One of the things they find is that somehow during using control, something happens in your brain, and Antonio Svila's paper later shows this kind of a buildup of a metabolite that needs to get removed again, where you need to actually give your brain a break in order to do your best work. And the way they tracked it was to give people self-control tasks in the morning, in the lunchtime, and in the evening, and then tracking whether the parts of the brain that actually help compute if you want to use self-control or not actually can work still or not. And the thing they find, and here's the point for time, for smart time management for yourself, if you still need convincing, here's the point. It's almost the same if you have an easy workday or a workday where you can switch between easy and hard stuff. But it is absolutely detrimental to that if you just go hard all day long and you're not allowed to do that. That is actually interesting to the degree that if you think about your 9 to 5 versus 5 to 9 scheme, you are asking your brain something very similar maybe sometimes. So that's the first thing. So knowing that your brain actually appreciates breaks a lot in order to be able to steer itself well. It's also the case that actually we can try and build a need for less self-control by having just good habits and thinking a bit. I think I heard it in the earlier talks. Think about it, how you get organized. So what do you really want to spend your time on? Because you have to tackle this on a systemic way. It's not healthy if you're basically every day trying to struggle to squeeze two things in. So trying to come up with places where you can use your precious cognitive control system for the stuff where you really need the flexibility, but then think smartly about what can I do so I can do things in a sustainable fashion for me and my brain. This is the almost only brain I'm showing today. This is from my work when I looked into what stress does to the self-control mechanisms, because you end up like overloading yourself. And so this is really like the gimmicky version when I give this. I have to actually, I feel like I have to apologize to you guys, because this is a talk I give in a damped down version for the public. So I explained the self-control systems that we studied easily in terms of like saying there's the ventromedial prefrontal cortex that's here, that basically asks you, what will I do in terms of trying to choose good actions? And then there are two roads where calculations need to happen that help you figure out what you want to do. One is trying to figure out what's the goals that you want to follow. That is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex around here, based on the work of my PhD advisor, Todd Hare, and others. There's beautiful papers who show that there needs to be an interplay between the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and the dorsolateral in order to say, I can follow long-term goals. But then there is also another type of information we could be getting, and that's based on our habitual, what are actions that we are usually taking that give us rewarding options. That's a pathway between the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and the ventral striatum and amygdala that would usually feed in that information. So when you are stressed, what we wanted to know is what happens to that system. And what happens is that actually the system gets affected in two ways. And I find that interesting because there is a dissociation between the feeling of having been stressed, so the cognitive dimension of being stressed, that really badly impairs the feeding in the long-term goal, in the sense that the system gets weaker. So when you are under stress, you will keep forgetting the context for which you are actually working more easily. And at the same time, there is a second thing happening, and that has to do with the physical reaction of cortisol being released in the body as mostly a response to social stressors. So social stressors under motivated performance, that's how we test it in the lab. And so that sounds very technical. What it is in practice is somebody is waiting for your result. You don't have enough time. They are writing you an email, and now you're kind of like, oh my God, I'm disappointing this person. So that is the type of stressor that will lead to this cortisol response. And what cortisol responses actually affect is this habit pathway that basically tries to say, hey, this would be a thing that you could usually do in this situation. That leads to a bit more short-sighted, well-practiced actions that you're taking later. And the two are happening at the same time when you get stressed, which makes it in total a bit harder, but not impossible to use self-control. Now, the interesting thing about this pathway of the cognitive bit is that the feeling of having been stressed is something that you can actually help reverse. And you do it by friendly social contact after the stressful situation. There's really nice work showing this from a group in Constance. Gudrun Sprösser was the author, who basically finds that when you are having a nice social encounter right after this situation of being stressed, the cortisol response actually falls flat in a sense. So you can prevent stress to actually manifest in the body, and you can actually also then prevent the habitual. They also test, we tested it with eating, they also tested it with eating. You can prevent the habitual answer in a sense. And that's really interesting because that has ramifications for how we work together. You may know the situation when something upsetting happens and you want to go to just quickly talk to a colleague in the neighboring office. I don't know, something where you want to organize something and you're not getting through, or you have a nasty meeting. And the thing to do is like to try and do what in the stress literature is called tend and befriend. So actually in that situation, seek out social support. And if you get that social support, it can actually rescue your ability to act later. That's really nice to know, I think, because there is hope, but it also means there needs to be good collaboration. And that's something I'm really interested in today, and I will comment a bit more on it later. Another thing where it might happen to come handy when you're not constantly on edges, like the other one was the first paper I ever wrote, and this is the last one I ever wrote in science. Another thing that might help is when you are still having capacity in order to ramp up a response in your sympathetic nervous system. So the stress response has three branches, like the quickest one is the sympathetic nervous system, the mid kind of like on the order of minutes, kind of like the middle route is the cortisol system, and then there's an even slower route through the neuroimmunology, so the immune system. Now, on that quick system, you may know that people, when you're slightly stressed, you also tend to get more productive, and that's the thing we find to also apply in self-control. So people who have the capacity to ramp up their arousal system during a self-control situation actually can control their feelings, but also then in a different task, their eating behavior better. That means it's also really beneficial to not run on stress all the time if you want to be able to steer your course nicely. So that is like the two branches or the two arguments on why you should actually help yourself by trying to figure out how can I do that in a sustainable fashion? That was the scientific argument part. Now coming to the practical bits, how can you actually now support yourself even in demanding times like nowadays? And I think one of the things that I practically find when I work with people, I today work a lot with software teams who are also in different places, who are also mixed in terms of professions, who have a lot of potential for stress also due to deadlines. And they always ask, like, what can I do? So the first thing to realize, it is actually a hard task in order to supply yourself through difficult times. A thing that helps tremendously in order to relieve the control by this system that I just showed you, that is a bit, that can actually go down a bit under stress, but not too much, is that you actually want to have clear priorities. So if you have a clear why you are doing things and where you're going with that, all your decisions become easier in a sense, and then maybe you don't even need to activate that system. It's also really helpful if you protect your focus for the hard things. And if your volunteering seems to be the hard thing, the work swap, the doing it in the good work time might be a good idea. Working in your biorhythm and doing your hardest work in the best, what you know is your best time during the day, really helps. And I really appreciate if people have the largesse in their jobs in order to do these and be allowed to swap that for the volunteering projects too, so that you can use your good work times. As Johanna already mentioned, I'm also in the camp of like keeping your brain fit in order to also help your capacity for control. The reason why we want to take breaks early and often, we just heard on the first slide, that was this basically don't go too long in a row. A thing that I want to get at in terms of like, because volunteering is actually very dear to your heart, as we heard. And it is actually an interesting fact about resilience, that resilience can come from the work we do too. I will show you in a bit why that is, but for now we can take it as a working definition that resilience is not something that can actually like, that is fixed or that we can measure and we say, hey, one person is maybe more resilient than the other and that's a fixed state. But actually in the last couple of years, it turns out that resilience seems to be something that is a more malleable concept. It's something that can grow in a person when we learn to act upon our values and we can learn to master challenges while we are doing actual work. And that is an interesting thing to realize when, like I casually mentioned earlier, yeah, so volunteering was always like my pet projects or the projects in which I challenged myself when my other work didn't allow me to do that. But that's an interesting opportunity to say like, hey, I can actually use that for growth. And you need to actually have good resources for that. So it's not possible to just have the personal resources and say, hey, we rely on volunteers, they will all just manage. But you also need like an overlap in the sense that a situation needs also to accommodate volunteering. So it's actually like coming from both sides of the individual and the organizational circumstances in which they work, that actually resilience grows. And that's something that's really overlooked a lot of the time. The discourse in many ways today often is like when you read social media or whatever, hey, how can I steer myself better? How can I become more resilient? It's always on the individual. And a thing I want to point out, and I tend to also say that to organizations who need to happen and hear to that, to listen to that, is actually that they need to also supply certain resources. So often we talk about how to manage your to-do list. And that actually in the end doesn't really matter, I think, to resilience too much. Something else that matters a lot more is that we have to acknowledge the fact that we are looking to two places in terms of where the resources of resilience come from. And a thing that we have to also acknowledge is that the core of it is coming from yourself, like what matters to you and where does your sense of coherence, as psychologists call that, come from. And the resources that we often look at is like talking about how to stay healthy, happy, and so on. We already said it. Having also some time for yourself, having time for your friends, having time for some form of spirituality if you need that. So that's all important, but that's not sufficient. What you need also in organizations to provide in order to have resilient members is there needs to be a culture of collaboration that's helpful. There needs to be a budget for doing stuff. 30K was not enough for a research project, right? There needs to be psychosocial support, in a sense, from each other when times get harder. There needs to be good leadership, and there need to be adequate ways of organizing things in terms of process, for example. So all these help, because if it's not possible to just say, hey, we delegate everything to one person, there needs to be two halves of that in terms of resources. You can't also all delegate everything to an organization. That's also not possible, but it needs to be balanced. Now, when you have resilience, you actually, I said, you act upon things and you grow by it, basically. So that's a nice opportunity in volunteering projects, because you are, based on your values, trying to contribute something. And by doing so, you have actually a source of resilience, in the sense that you often experience a control of the situation. You are in mastery because you have the skills, you have the knowledge, you want to contribute something. You're probably also optimistic, because if you have control, skills, and knowledge, you are knowing that you can actually master the situation. And in the end, you grow by these challenges that you master, and you can become more confident that the next project, even if it's bigger, can also work again. So that's a really nice opportunity, because the opportunity is that you can shape the project fully by yourself, by saying, hey, this is exactly what I want to do, because the reality of research projects is always, it would be nice if we were always able to do that, but not always we are able to actually shape them the way we would like. And in terms of, I'll skip that one for the sake of time, but I want to give one more pointer in terms of practicalities. If you happen to work in collaborative projects with larger teams, like the project I showed you in the beginning was actually a project between 4 people, one of which wasn't even in academia, but a researcher in a think tank. My co-PI actually, during the project, moved to the US, got at least 1 kid, and started planning the next one. So we are kind of stretched out in terms of time, and our 4th collaborator was very busy in his research and other work. So we were actually quite stretched, and we could all just contribute what we could promise. And that was something we talked about very openly in the beginning. So we together discussed, what's the proportion of my regular work week that I could dedicate to that project? And that was something I wanted to know, because I actually didn't want to be in the situation that in the end, nobody contributes what they promise. So we actually have to kind of scope the project well in terms of what can we actually do. Also, it's good to know if I'm only available on request, or if I'm in a project leadership function, I need to be able to regularly drive things forward. And if need be, also during my work week, for example, because we were interacting with people who can't really understand if we are just writing emails on Sundays. Also, knowing when to reach somebody and how to reach them, if it's urgent, if there is a certain urgency, or if they can take their time in order to respond. And also to know, and I find that bit quite crucial, asking people what they are offering happily, and what are the things where they hope for the other guys to contribute, and just having an open conversation, because particularly the second bit often gets overlooked, but it is good to know what's actually tasks that other people really don't want to do or can't do at all, because that means we need maybe some other person in our team. And then understanding how we meet again, and who actually does binding commitments on what they will contribute by which time, so we can move on together, is also really important. So having this collaborative way of holding yourselves accountable really helped, in order to be sure that the actual result can be delivered, because in the end we were expected to actually publish something. So that bit, I would say, concludes the talk part. And if you want to ask anything later on, feel free to reach out to me. And thanks to you for your attention.